Welcome to Learning Aloud, a podcast from the Organizational Dynamics community at the University of Pennsylvania, produced to inspire purposeful leadership practice and transform organizational experience. I am your host, Stephen G. Hart. My guest today is a new affiliated faculty member of the Organizational Dynamics program, Timothy J. Richards. Tim retired from the General Electric Company at the beginning of 2019 after a 23-year career. For his last 2 years at GE, Tim served as the GE's Global Senior Executive for Government Affairs and Policy, where he led a 43-person team based around the world. In this capacity, he was responsible for GE's strategic relationships with governments and government-owned entities outside the United States. Throughout his career at GE, Tim served in a variety of government affairs positions, including Managing Director for Government Affairs and Policy in the Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey, based in Abu Dhabi. He also served as GE's Managing Director for Energy Policy, based in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining GE, Tim was the Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Western Europe and the Middle East. He also served as the Trade Policy Attaché at the United States Mission to the European Union in Brussels, and as their Director for Information Industry Trade Policy at the Office of the United States Trade Representative. Tim is the co-author with Michael Gadbow of Intellectual Property Rights, Global Conflict, Global Consensus. Tim has a new and exciting course on the Organizational Dynamics program called Business Strategies for Engaging with Government. He stopped by our studio today to tell me more about it. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Steve. It's a real pleasure to be with you today, and thank you for having me.
That's a great pleasure. Now, you write in your syllabus, this course will equip future business and government leaders with an understanding of the ways government actions influence business results, and will introduce proven methods for optimizing growth and reducing risk from interaction with governments. So why is this topic so important today, and what specifically do you want participants to come away with after taking your course?
Well, Steve, the problem statement for the course is summed up really well in a study that McKinsey conducted in 2013. They found that government decisions impact fully 30% of company profits. That's 30% of profits. And yet, at the same time, companies and other organizations do a rather poor job of organizing to engage with government. So this course is about taking a strategic approach to filling that gap or that blind spot that organizations tend to have, to treat engagement with governments as a top organizational priority, just like finance or human resources or marketing. And in this intensive one-week course, we're going to take a look at what governments do that causes such a high impact, and we'll take a look at ways organizations can and do approach their engagement with governments in a strategic way. And by strategic, we're going to include understanding the political and policy environment in which an organization operates, prioritizing the government-related issues of greatest importance to that organization, and pursuing advocacy campaigns on those priority issues.
Well, that sounds great. And as a fellow faculty member, I find the design of your course really interesting. You've organized the content into what I could see as 5 major parts and created about 14 different segments in all, covering a pretty wide range of content. Tell me more about the way you designed the course and what the various segments will cover.
That's a really good question. Over the course of my career in GE, at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, and going back even into the 1980s when I was working for the Semiconductor Industry Association, I developed a number of ideas about how organizations and industries can truly change the environment in which they operate. But when you're a practitioner, frequently you don't have time to think about these things in a theoretical way. You're just doing it. And the hard part of creating the course was to start by figuring out how to pull together a disparate collection of practitioners' gut feelings and gut experience and make it something meaningful to students. Having thought about it a lot, I decided that we needed to start with the basics. And the real element the real base element in engaging with governments is the government decision. There's always a decision that's going to be the inflection point for either positive or negative consequences. So we start with understanding government decisions, and then we turn to how does the private sector engage in campaigns, advocacy campaigns, which are the way in which the private sector generally tries to make its voice heard on those government decisions. So we start with that. Then we take a step back and we look at the 4 different ways that government and the private sector interact. Those are government in a role as policymaker, government as a regulator, which is the nuts and bolts of implementing policy, government as a partner, when the government is actually engaged in public-private partnerships or other means of actively coordinating with the private sector, and finally, government as a customer, because frequently governments are buying large quantities of goods and services. At that point, now that we've gotten through all of that, we're going to introduce the strategic aspect. And that means we're going to understand those things that I've already talked about. How do we understand the environment we're operating in, prioritize and pursue advocacy campaigns, and select the right items. And finally, we're going to discuss how to organize in terms of staffing, in terms of culture, in terms of leadership to be effective in this strategic engagement.
It really sounds fascinating, and I really appreciate it. I also think that some of the coursework takes place in Washington, D.C. Is that right?
That is right. It's an exciting part of the course. And I'm really enthusiastic about the fact that this course is going to be very interactive. The intention is to use case studies, simulations, role-playing, and learn not only from me and from each other in the class, but also learn from people who are doing these things outside of the academic community and outside of my experience. So we'll spend the first half of the course here in Philadelphia, and then we'll move down to Washington, D.C. And we're going to ask a number of company and government affairs leaders and people from organizations like think tanks and trade associations to come in and join us, or we will go and visit them in their facilities to learn about what they do. And at the end of the course, we're going to finish with students making a presentation on a case study where they will present to a number of government affairs professionals who will be playing the role of a board of directors and CEO, and they'll give feedback directly to the students. Yeah. And all that's possible because we'll be at the Penn Biden Center in Washington.
Yeah, it's a great resource. And I've checked out some of the reading material and reference materials you've assembled for this course. Very impressive. And you've got some great stuff in there, ranging from surveys, case studies, and videos. How did you go? I mean, you must have had a real challenge assembling or choosing these specific materials. How do they support the learning objectives for the course?
Well, the first thing I found when I started putting this course together was that there is no such thing as a textbook in this area.
Of course not.
It doesn't exist.
Well, maybe you should write it.
Maybe sometime. Maybe after doing the course a few times,
There you go.
it will naturally emerge. But what I've done is started by figuring out what I wanted to say anyway. What was the course intended to teach? And then I took that back and started looking at my own bookshelves and doing some research to find out what was out there in terms of material that would be able to provide the right background on each of these subject areas. And we have a pretty eclectic mix, as you say. We have some things like readings from the University of Pennsylvania Journal of International Law, which are somewhat traditional academic sort of pieces. We have surveys from McKinsey. I've mentioned one of them already. We'll read and use some tools that I first learned about in Six Sigma courses when I was becoming a black belt in Six Sigma within GE. And a lot of those things are really applicable to the subject matter of this course. And we'll do some things like read a newsletter for racing sailors that talks about strategy and tactics. And we'll learn from that how we can apply those concepts back into the business world.
Right. I know you're an avid sailing.
It's one of my great loves.
So we'll get into that just a little bit later on. I think the other part that I really love about the course is the impressive line of guests you have for your course that you're going to bring in to have people speak to the class. And your co-author, Michael Gadbauer, is one, and George Pickard from GE Power, among others. Tell me more about your guest speakers and what you hope they're going to bring to the course.
I've been really fortunate in my career working at that intersection between government and the private sector to have some fantastic mentors and colleagues, people who have taught me, who I've learned from, and been able to model my own activity around. And as I started to think about this course, it just seemed natural to ask many of those people to be part of it. Yeah. And so that's one of the other advantages of going down to Washington.
Being in D.C.,
it makes it easier.
yes, exactly.
But some will come to some will come here to Philadelphia as well. So you mentioned Mike Gadbaugh and George Picard. I'll just say a couple words, and then I'll mention some other of the people who will be joining us. Mike is currently with Georgetown University School of Law, but before that he was at GE. He was my boss at GE for about 10 years. And before that, we worked together on the Semiconductor Industry Association matters that I mentioned. He is somebody who is constitutionally incapable of thinking inside the box. I think the students are really going to enjoy him. He's got tremendous background in everything we're going to talk about. He is working as an academic now. He's been a practitioner. I think he'll be a really interesting person. Yeah. And then George Picard is the person I most respect on the field of engaging with government as a customer. That's mostly what he does with GE Power. And he'll be coming with some case studies. And I think the students will find George to be a fascinating person. It's an area that you don't really get to read much about. And George is somebody who knows how to talk about that subject. And I think he'll be really good at that. And then others who have confirmed an interest subject to their travel commitments include Kelly Myman, who is a managing partner with McLarty Associates, Hani Sabra, who analyzes political developments for corporate clients, Judith Barnett, who has served in 3 administrations and now consults on international business, the Dutch ambassador to the United States and some of his staff, and finally Karan Bhatia, who is the external affairs vice president of Google.
Yeah, it's an incredibly impressive list of people. Fascinating. So close to the end of your course, I think it's around in segment 14 of the course, you have student presentations and a concluding project that participants will get in. And when I read the description for this part of the course, it reads more like a case study for which you then ask students to answer specific questions. What do you want the students to produce for their final presentation and concluding project?
Well, the idea of the concluding project is to serve as a integration of everything that we've talked about in the course. And in the course, we will have taken a look at and even used certain model documents. And the idea is to present a case study that is a challenging situation for a private sector entity and have the students break into small groups and each group come up with a recommended game plan for responding to this challenging situation. And what I hope is that they will not only put their own brain power into it, but that they will actively tap into the experts that we have had coming into the class and use some of those models for how to go about addressing these types of issues and put together a game plan that is quite specific in terms of what they recommend doing. And then, as I mentioned before, they will present that to a board of directors. And the board of directors will be composed of people who do these things. And so they will not only have the experience of presenting it, but they will have the experience of getting direct feedback from these practitioners with whom they will have met. So I think it's an exciting way to cap off the course.
Yeah, it is exciting. It's also quite challenging, I think, too.
Well, we will see how it works. I haven't tried this one before, so we'll see how it works. But I suspect that this group is going to find it interesting, hopefully challenging, but I'm sure they're going to rise to the challenge.
I think they will. And I think the fact that it's so engaging is fabulous. So are there any other things about the course that you'd like to share with our audience before we close out our conversation?
Well, 2 things come to mind, Steve. And we'll touch on both of these concepts in the course. The first is something my wife Meg and I have talked about a lot. She's an architect. And when we lived in Abu Dhabi, as you mentioned, she taught architecture there. And we would sit and have coffee in the mornings and talk about what she needed to do to teach the subject well. And we kept coming back to a point that architects call their partie. A partie is a big idea for a design. And it has to be maintained throughout the entire design. And when it is done that way, it's incredibly effective. For instance, the partie of Falling Water, Frank Lloyd Wright's famous house design.
House design, yes.
It's a series of rectangles rotating around a central hearth, much like a water wheel in the stream. And he's taken that idea and he sticks with it. And every one of those concepts is always there in the design. So this is something that it inspires, it guides, it suffuses the design. And as we talked about this, we realized that the same kind of thing can apply for any creative activity. So if you're designing a new product, or even if, in my field, if you're developing ideas for new public policies, if you have a partie, people feel it. It gives a coherence and it inspires throughout the process. And if you don't have it, people feel that too. So I think it's a really important concept and one that can be applied in any organization. And the last aspect of a partie is it has to be expressible in a fairly direct way, in one sentence or maybe two sentences. And so if those who are listening try this, try to be able to, any project you're working on, try to be able to say in one sentence what it's about, and also make sure that that's something that is as true on the 10th day that you're doing it as it was on the first day that you're doing it. It'll make an incredible difference in the quality of the projects people work on. So that's one thing. The second idea that we'll touch on goes back to sailing. We talked just a touch about sailing, but it is something that I love. And as I mentioned, we're going to be looking in this class at a couple of articles about strategy and tactics, where we will take ideas from the field of sailing and apply them to the field of business.
I love that metaphor, by the way. It's great.
It works really well. There are dozens of other parallels between sailboat racing and business. Three of the ones that we'll talk about are, I really think, important. The first is no one on a boat can get to the finish line, which is the mission in any race, faster than anyone else on the boat. You can't do it. A friend of mine is a naval, yeah, well, you have to swim really fast.
Right.
A friend of mine who's a naval submariner says the Navy has this idea too, and they express it as one crew, one screw. We are all together in this big vessel, and we can't get there any better. We can't fulfill our mission any better unless we do it together. So in sailing, we really are all in the same boat. It's true in business too. We are truly in the same boat. Second, every action or inaction by every member of the crew has an effect. It either is going to make the boat go faster or it's going to make the boat go slower. There's no middle ground. There aren't any timeouts. There are no mulligans. Everyone and everything is important always. And I think that's also true in any organization. It should be true in any organization. There should never be anybody whose actions are unimportant.
That's right. Everybody's important, yeah.
And third is prioritization. The fastest way to improve performance is to prioritize and then work through it. So you can't do everything at once. You have to identify the areas of potential improvement first and improve those that are going to have the biggest impact on a boat's finishing results. The exact same, this is actually very much of a Six Sigma concept too, and something that we did a lot when I was in GE. But on a racing boat, for instance, you might say the first thing we need to do before anything else is to train the crew, to make sure the crew knows how to trim the sails, they know how to communicate with each other. Then you can move on to working on your strategy. Then you can move on to working on the hardware, buying new sails, cleaning the bottom of the boat, those things. But that's about prioritization. And so what it really comes down to is organizational leaders who think about these things have to realize that selecting the team that can do those things, that can work in that capacity, and then inspiring the team to work toward perfection, every single person, and to coordinate in that process, it's really, that's what can make a great leader. So those are just two additional ideas that are more conceptual that I thought I'd bring up.
Well, I love it, and I think it's a great metaphor for both for leadership and for all kinds of endeavors of the human spirit, really, and some of the things you talked about. I want to really thank you for coming by today and talk about this new course. I wish you all the very best with it, and I hope you'll come again to talk with us about how it went. And I believe the first presentation of this course is going to run as an intensive 1 week starting Friday, June the 7th in Philadelphia,
Yes.
and concludes on Thursday, June 13th in Washington, D.C. So it truly is intensive.
It truly is. I'm really looking forward to it. I would love to come back and talk about it again after we finished it. And thank you so much, Steve, for having me.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.